place with heaven, if I can say it that way, and just looking at that subject. And we're going to touch slightly on it tonight a bit, looking forward to that city, because we've talked about heaven coming down, a heavenly city, and it's something that it's good to put our mind on heavenly things. And remember that, there's a lot of stuff happens in our world today, but there's something heavenly that waits. There's something about to appear. There's something that's going to break forth in the sky. So I don't know about you, but I just think, hey, I'm glad that I've got something to look forward to. Are you the same? Okay, so the book of Hebrews says this, and I'm going to read it. It talks about Abraham, and it's Hebrews 11. I'm going to read verses 8 through 10. And so if you're getting to your Bible, open it, or your phone, or your iPad, or your PlayStation, or whatever you read your Bible on. I'm not sure what you can do. But, okay, so I'm going to read it. Okay, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And when we just take a moment and think about that, you realize his whole life was focused on the one thing, and it was the city that God had promised that he was building him, that he was bringing to him, that would descend from above, and he would spend time in eternity with God, with the Lord. So when you think about that for a minute, you realize, well, how do I get there? Well, I've got to trust, obviously, in the work of Jesus Christ and what he done on the cross. And that, all of a sudden, when you accept him, becomes your destiny. All of a sudden, the destiny, we had a destiny by default. Anybody know where it was? Somebody went that way, off the platform. And okay. So there's a destiny that we have by default, and it was in heaven. I'll just say it that way. We'll look at the topic of hell some other time, but not tonight. And we've got a destiny now that's been set for everybody who says, I trust Jesus and his work, to go to heaven. And I want to look at Abraham and his life and what type of character he was. When they had this testimony about him, he waited on that city that was coming. Because that's a powerful thing. I mean, if God was looking at you and writing and saying, well, I want to write something down about Henry, would he say, Henry waited in that city that came from God, because he realized his home wasn't here. He realized there was something greater that was set out for his life. So the book of Romans declares Abraham's faith always had choice. And I find it very interesting because, we do lots of choice. So faith is a choice. You get that, right? Faith is you making a choice about something. Unbelief is a choice. We choose to have faith, or we choose to not believe. So your faith in God and your unbelief begin and are sustained by a decision. And that decision, I decide and you decide every day to reinforce what way you're going to, you look for evidence. In other words, you think, what evidence do I have to support my belief mechanism? That there is a God, or that there isn't a God? And that's how God can heal or God won't heal. Well, but you have to make a decision about it, and you have to do it daily. And you have to look for evidence for it. So if you've got, I don't believe God will do a certain thing, you will search for evidence. It's a reticular part of the brain at the back that will search for evidence to back up what you believe. So when you think like that, it causes you to think, and me to think, that faith and unbelief are forms of faith. Now hang in there. In other words, they need constant reinforcing. What you believe today needs constant reinforcing. If you're I don't believe certain things in the Bible, you have to go out and reinforce that. For instance, if you take the topic about eternal security, when you give your life to Jesus, that he keeps you to the end, That's a super way to think and believe, by the way. But if you believe that, you will look through the Bible and you will look for that. If you believe that you can lose your salvation, you will constantly look for reasons why you can lose your salvation. Because you have to go and chase out and chase down what you believe. It's the way you and I are engineered, and that's how faith works. In other words, I'm just saying that to make this statement. Faith is an ongoing decision or choosing. I choose today to worship. I choose today to lay my life down. I choose today to present myself. I choose today to forgive. I choose today not to get angry. I choose today Jesus' way above my way. I choose today to love somebody. Whatever it is, but it's an ongoing choosing. Because everybody on the planet lives by faith. That's really what we're looking at. Just ask them. You ask somebody, what do you believe? Especially if you get a non-Christian. I mean, they're ready to tell you what to believe. Isn't that right? So they've got faith to believe in nothing. All right? Well, I don't believe that stuff that you believe. It's nonsense. I don't believe that Jesus died. I think it's just madness. And they'll tell you that, and they'll say, this is what I believe. When you die, there's nothing. Or when you die, I turn into an angel. They'll have this reason what they believe, and they will share it. Because they choose to go down that road, and that's where their faith lies. The problem is this, and I want you to understand this. Whether you're a believer or not, you cannot prove without a shadow of a doubt what you believe is true. I know you believe it, I get that. I believe what I believe without a shadow of a doubt, but I can't prove it to you. Something's got to connect me with my faith, and obviously that's going to be the Lord. Are you with me? So there's something that you can't prove and I can't prove. An atheist can't prove to me that there's no God. But I understand that I can't prove to them that there is a God, because they will reason that away. Have you ever been in a situation where you've talked like that? So you realize sometimes you can have a battle. So, in other words, I'm saying this, atheism then, not believing in God, is kind of like a faith. I have faith that there is no God. Because faith is believing in something you can't see, that you have evidence for. So they've went and got evidence for it and said, no such thing. Science is a kind of faith. Communism is a kind of faith. In fact, all world religions are a faith of types. When you look at it, cults, sects, everything, they're all types of faith. So we have to start thinking in our world, we've no choice but to live by faith. It's just where you're going to place it, how you're going to choose, where you're going to focus your faith. Does that make sense? So the question I want to pose, what will you, what will I, what will we choose to put our faith in? What will you choose to put your faith in tonight, tomorrow? What steps will I prepare when we think of the city coming down? Or if we're going to go to present heaven before future heaven comes here, in other words, when we die, how are we going to prepare to live a life and go there? What are we going to do? What choices are you going to make? What are you going to do with yourself? What will shape what you will become in this life? What's going to happen? I'm just asking you the question, what will shape you? What will shape me? And that's why I want to look at Abraham just tonight, just briefly. I want to go to Romans 4. So let's go there, if you're going to your Bible, Romans 4. And I'm going to look at verse 16. We'll read down to 22. Okay? Are you okay? You? Okay. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. In hope, he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told. So shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb, that's his wife. No unbelief made him waver in concerning the promises of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he promised in verse 22. That is why his faith, Abraham's faith, was counted to him as righteousness. So here we have the father of faith. And we're just reading the record that Paul puts down to give us that insight to how he's living and what he's doing. He's telling us the internal process that happened inside Abraham. And we'll get a wee look at it. But what happened in his heart when he met with God? Because he had to make a choice to believe him. He had to make a choice to believe God's promise. And at the moment Abraham became righteous by faith, and let me just read it again, in 20 and 22, it says this: no unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. That is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. Thank you, Grant. That is why it's getting hot up here. So you realize if you go back into Genesis 15, there's Abraham and he's underneath the stars and he's looking at the stars, or he's in his tent and God says, come on out and have a look at the stars. I've just done this for you. And he goes out. God says, look up, count all them stars. And he's caught with the task. And this is the very real, very unseen, very present God who's speaking with him and communicating to him. And God says, count those stars, and if you can count them, your descendants are going to be like that. Now that's a wild promise. And I know that you've heard it many times, but I mean it's nearly incomprehensible when you think, could I count the stars? You ever tried it? You ever lay down in a field when you weren't drunk and just looked up at I'm just saying, because I'm looking at some of your faces and thought, you were lay drunk. But you've laid there and looked up at the stars and just been mesmerized by them. And you just think, I could never count those. And God's making this massive promise to Abraham. You'll not be able to count your descendants, even though you haven't got one. So God's moving out in something massive. And you start to think, well, not only did Abraham believe that, but he believed there was a city coming. And he says, I'm living for the city that's made by God, and its foundation is made by God. So I was kind of looking at this, and I was thinking, like, if I was Abraham, if you were Abraham, and God sort of starts speaking to you like that, and you go out and he says, count all them stars. You're going to have more. And I know you've no kids at the minute, it's not working for you, and you're a lad, and she's done, and you're done, but I'm going to make your descendants more. And in fact, if I had went to the doctor would have said, you no hope, son. You're done. She's done. Both of you went lie down and just forget about it. But it must have put him in a really awkward position. When you're talking to God Almighty and the Lord looks at you and says, I'm going to do this. And you're looking at yourself and you're looking at her and you're going, I feel really weak about this. I know you're God, but like, come on, like we're done. We're dead. There's nothing going to happen here. So I kind of think Abraham was in a position because of fertility and because of years, and the promise just wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't happen. Something, a nature-defying, and we sang about God tonight and how powerful He is, a nature-defying miracle was needed to be performed for this promise to happen. Something spectacular had to take place, something that was just out of this world. And Abraham, for some reason, I don't know why, because it doesn't tell me why, but he went, I'm going to believe you. I'm going to believe you on what you just said. As much as it doesn't look like this can happen, I'm going to believe in you. And somehow he seems to grab hold and say, I'm taking hold of the promise that Yahweh had spoken to him. He's going, I know you're the creator, so look, surely you're the creator, and my teeny weeny silly wee mind and how I think about the world doesn't come in and is not comparable to what you just said here, even though everything screams it can't be. God, you must be able to bring the dead back to life. You must be able to call into existence. That's what we're reading. Things that don't even exist. That's who you are. That's who I believe you are. And that's a big ask, because you and I, with all our reading and with all our understanding, still get stuck in some small words and some simple principles. All of us that the Bible talks about. Because somehow we reduce God to our mindset. And Abraham thought, I will not do that. God is way, way bigger. If he calls things into being that don't exist, a baby is no big deal to him. This is not an issue for him. It's never an issue for him. So he chose to believe the power of God over the power of nature. He just thought, it doesn't matter what nature says. It doesn't matter what that circumstance looks like. I really believe God. I really believe God. So we really got caught up saying, I'm ready to believe God. So I want to ask the question, or maybe just look at quickly as we looked at this. What faith is not? Faith is not, and I hear this lots, people quoting a verse and say, I'm going to believe that, and I'm just going to keep saying it. And I'm going, faith doesn't come by you forcing yourself to believe something. You can't force yourself to believe something. Faith's a gift that comes from God. He's got to give you it. And I love people find something to read it and say, I'm going to believe that. Say, knock yourself out with that one, see how that works. Because I've done that for years and it doesn't work. Faith is something that actually arises from heaven to you. It's not about positive thinking. It's not something we generate on the inside. It's something, as I said, you definitely receive. It's something that God gives us. And to make it really, really simple tonight, it says this in Ephesians, and Paul writes to Ephesians, this is what he says, and we've read it so many times, he says, but it was by grace you've been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. So when you look at me and say, have faith, Lewis, you're asking me to have something, but I can't have it unless God gives it to me. Because it's a gift. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's some things I have faith for and other things I don't have faith for. I don't have faith for, can I pick on you on? Aren't we? Is that all right? I'm not going to pick on Andrew. He was really happy when I said that. No, I'm not. But I mean, I look in the mirror and I think to myself, I haven't got any faith that I'm going to get younger or more beautiful looking, because you can't improve in perfection. Isn't that right? But I mean, I just look and say, well, I'm not going to change. I don't have faith to do that, so I haven't got faith for that to happen. I haven't got faith that my hair is going to grow. Has anybody here got faith that my hair is going to grow? No? Okay. But you understand, you can't just muster it up. You've got to receive the gift of faith and allow it to grow inside you and understand it's something that happens from God. So let me say this. If you become a believer and you've got salvation and God gives you faith to believe, then you start saying, oh, okay, I recognize God gave me a gift. And then you start to exercise it. Not for what you want, but for what God wants you and I to do and how he wants us to live and how he calls us out to pursue him. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? It feels very hot up here. I hope you're enjoying it too. So if I think about what did Abraham choose to believe just in the few short passages we looked at in Romans 4. In verse 17 we see this. Abraham chose to believe God can bring life from the dead. I believe that God can do that. When all hope is gone, Abraham said, I can believe that God can bring life from the dead. He chose to believe God can do something that doesn't exist. He can bring something out of nothing. That's powerful. And it's powerful working faith. It doesn't exist. He believes in the creator of the universe and says, he's a creator of the universe. The next thing he chose to believe that God would do what he promised to do, even after all natural hope was gone. Has anybody here lost a bit of hope? Just me? you and me. A few of us have. We just lose hope. Abraham was at the place where he says, I've lost hope. But I'm going to take this gift that God gave me of faith, and I'm going to say, look, there's nothing natural that can happen, but my hope isn't in the natural. My hope's in a supernatural God. And he makes this shift. And he says, I'm going to hope. I'm going to hope. So he sets his hope and he makes his choice, and he says, well, there's a few things I'm choosing to believe here. He chose to believe the next one. He chose to believe that God would keep his promise no matter how long he had to wait. So there's an element of faith. Sometimes we give up after a week, or sometimes we give up after several years, and sometimes we just give up. Abraham thought, it doesn't matter how long I've got to wait. I think there's something that some smart scholar said it was 25 years before he receives the promise of a son. That's a long time. And somebody shoved the wee Ishmael in there as well. It's interesting. I love the story about Ishmael because God blessed the boots of Ishmael because he loved him. But he wasn't the chosen one. What a great God that we have. But he chose to believe God would keep his promise. The other thing that we read in verse 20 says he chose to nurture his faith so it grew stronger over the passing of time. Now, we have a natural tendency, or our default is just to say, well, I've been hoping, so I've given up. I can't go any further with it. And Abraham thought, I'm not going to be like that. Every day that goes by, I'm going to keep growing stronger. And it told us that because he gave glory to God. And I kind of figured it went like this: God, you know what? Hasn't happened yet, but I know you can. So I believe what you said is going to be true. So I'm just going to get up, and every day I'm going to look and say, God, I still believe. I'm hoping where there's no hope. I'm going to nurture, I'm going to nurse it. I'm going to feed it, and I'm going to speak to it. I still believe this. Or whatever way it is, but I'm going to allow it to grow. I'm going to water it. Like God said it will happen. I might have to wait a bit longer. And the devil, I'm sure, was active then too. You've waited long enough, it's not going to happen. The other thing that I want to look at about what he chose to believe is the last one in verse 21. It says this: he chose to believe God has the power to do all that he says he's going to do. I'm going to let that hang there because there's so many people in this room at some point or other in their lives have thought this. I don't think God's going to do this. I don't think it's going to happen. You've believed so long, thought, no, it's not going to happen. Well, it can't happen. And how you sneak out of stuff like that, or kind of say, well, God, you're not going to do this. This is what you say, because I'm a bad person. Because I didn't make the grade, so therefore God won't fulfill the promise. As if you being a good girl or a good boy is going to cause God to fulfill his promise. Do you know that's outside of what God says, unless it's a condition? If God says, Abraham, I'm going to bring you a child and you're going to have father of multitude, doesn't matter how Abraham... In fact, Abraham was a bit of a porky teller. If you just read the story about his life, he told lies all the time, and God says, yeah, well, as well, I'm not counting you being just wonderful. I give you the gift of righteousness. Why? Because you believed me, not because you behaved right. So maybe you haven't been behaving right, but God says, I've made promises to you about a city that's coming, about a heaven that's going to be yours. And if you're not going to look at it, if you're going to think you're not going to make it because of that, you're missing the point of who I am. And God sets promises so we can have hope as we're going through life. Why would people choose not to believe the gospel? Why would people choose not to believe? Everybody here knows at least 100 people that don't believe. Don't we know loads of people that don't believe? And you think, why can they not see? Why will they not believe? Why will they not receive? Well, I want to give you a couple of pointers that I think. Because everybody has their own story to tell. I was going to say Tory, but it's a story. And I think they fall into certain categories. So I think that, now, look, this is just me. You're probably smarter and work other things out, but most people who are atheists that I've met sort of fall into this sort of camp. They're angry. They're just angry. They don't believe because they're angry at God. Why are they angry at God? Because God failed the answer, or God allowed something to happen that they didn't agree with, but they have this thing rooted in anger. And they become so angry they kill God in their mind. That's what they do. There's no way there's a God, because he wouldn't have allowed an earthquake to happen in Turkey and Syria and allows 8,000 people. That can't be a loving God. And that's the way they look at it, and they're not considered anything else. They've just got this philosophy, and that's what they believe, so they build a wall around it and say, there is no God. So I think they just get angry at that. Or people get bitter because they have hateful attitudes toward others. Now, but nobody in this room that has that. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? We don't ever feel like that, sure we don't. But that's what they do. And their heart becomes hard and cold to faith. I mean, take for instance, and maybe this is you, and you've been violated in some way. Maybe you've been betrayed, and we start to hate people, and God made people, and how could God love Lewis? Because Lewis done this to me, so therefore you think, well, there's no God because he couldn't love a guy like that. Do you know what I mean? And that's what people do. Or atheists do. They put excuses on. I don't believe in God, and it's very hard to break through. Another one is people fear judgment. Atheists fear judgment. And you can't talk to them about an afterlife or a city coming down. Why? Because they're frightened of judgment. That God's going to, this God that we talk about, they don't want judgment, so they want to relieve their own psychological belief patterns or get rid of the pressure about a God who will deal with them at the end of their life, to say, I'm not going to talk to you about your life. So what they do is they fear judgment, and they say, well, I don't believe there is a God. And they convince themselves there is no God. And that means there's no one will hold me accountable. And atrocities in our world are often done by people who believe there is no judgment, and what I'm doing is okay because nobody will ever put me up on it. Hebrews 9:27 tells us this, and just as it's appointed man wants to die, then the judgment. Wants to die, then the judgment. So it will be a fearful thing. Now, please understand, we've moved. When you receive Jesus, you move from judgment to life. Okay? That's kind of cool, because when you die, you'll wake up in life. If you don't know Jesus, when you die, you're looking at judgment. It's a whole different story, a whole different ballgame. But they get this in their heads and away they go. The other thing is why people or atheists want to set God aside and just believe or not believe he's there. They're drawn to pleasures in this world. They're drawn, so they begin denying God, and they start to appease and try and calm themselves down so they don't have to worry about what's happening. Say, I'm never going to be punished ever for following what I want. But if I admit there is a God, then I've got a problem because I'm in the wrong camp. And that's what they'll do, so they can't go there. And they don't want to go there. And that's why people do that. That's why atheists push away God. And the last one I want to bring to you, why people do not. Because we talk to people all the time about God and about heaven and about having faith and having hope in a risen Christ who's coming back. And you're thinking, well, why do they not receive? Why do they not? I want to share a story, but I haven't asked the person, can I? Should I share it or not? Would it be all right if you were sitting here and I share a very intimate story about you? Would that be all right? Would it? I can say what I want. Well, as long as it's not me, Glenn says, all right, I'll let you share. Sandra, lift your hand. I looked at you and you went, all right, lift your hand. Can I share this? Well, you're the only Sandra I know. Just lift your hand up. Wave at me. Go ahead. Listen, you don't want me to share it, I won't. It's just how you get saved. Sandra came into church, all right? She was one of these believing unbelievers. She's not today because Jesus is her Savior, which is phenomenal. But when she came in and everybody in the church thought she was saved because she was so little. If you talked to her, she was worshiping Jesus, she was praying, and I was going, right. I said, but have you given your life to Jesus? Well, no, not yet. But I love church and I love worship. Remember, and I love praying. And I would go, okay, well, do you know you've got this? God's brought you here because you either get in or you're in a problem. I'm just not ready. I need to think it through. And every week she came, I thought, I'm going to get this person. So every week he came, my Cromer says, well, where are you at? And have you met with Jesus? And she was saying, well, no, not yet. I have to think it through. And I don't know when I'm going to get saved. So I told her the story when I tried to fix when I would get saved. And because I had a whole lot of partying and drinking to do before I gave my life to Jesus. So I had it all set out. And then Jesus said, what happens if I come back tomorrow, Liz? You're in a mess. So I went and I told her the story. And she went, no, and I know God's real, but I'm not ready yet. And then I went, well, I'm not worthy. So we went down that road. And I don't know, many times, until one day I walked up and I said, God, Lord, I really don't know what to do with this girl. Because I've tried every manipulative, coercive tactic to try and get her into the kingdom. She's not going. And I knew in my heart, and I thought, look, do you know what? I can't get her across the line because God opens the heart of people and said, well, Lord, I know, and I know that God was, thank you for coming here because you helped me learn something about me and about my frustration. And I just watched and thought, wow, this is really interesting. So then she came in, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and it was after the service. She sat at the front, and I went over, and she was trembling a bit, and tears were in her eyes, and she was about to get saved. But just before that happened, I said, what is it about your word that you won't give your life to Jesus? And she said this to me, and it took me out by the roots. She says, Lewis, you don't understand what you're asking me to do, because you're asking me to marry Jesus Christ as my Savior, and I need to make sure I'm going the whole way. Here's my, oh my word. I just rocked my boat when you said that, by the way, Santa, because then you're asking me to marry a person. You're asking me to be married to Christ. And I went, wow. She said, I need to think about that. And all the times I was talking about invitation, she was saying, you're asking such a big commitment, I need to make sure. I was stunned with the answer. Anyway, it came, we were sitting outside, and she's trembling, shaking. She says, I want to give my life to Jesus now. And then she came to the Lord. But it's a powerful story because, see, you and I, or maybe not you and I was trying to push people into the kingdom. And then I realized, wow, you can't. Because when God's ready, he'll open the heart, he'll open the heart. And you can give me a season, peach in season, out of season, and be ready. I was ready every week. And she done my head in. And then I gave up and I said, Lord, she's doing my head. And the Lord says, I know, I love her. I'm going to win her over. And I'm not saying anything about not being ready. I'm just saying, hey, do you know what? Maybe the person that you're waiting on, and they're stuck somewhere. And you need to be saying, Lord, I'm waiting on you to open their heart. And then there's something I believe about the power of the kingdom that gets released. Some people don't come to Christ because of a reaction to religion. They have a picture of an unloving God, or a picture that he's been cruel, or he's powerless, or he's vengeful. And they think to themselves, they're just going to find another God to worship other than the God of the Bible. Especially when they read the Old Testament, and the Old Testament tells them, it'll just say, and God wiped out 700 billion people. No, God wiped out thousands of people. Say, how could a loving God do that? Because they haven't comprehended. And then they'll think there's a different God in the Old Testament and the New Testament when there's not. It's the same message. It's never changed. So you look at it. So I want to finish off probably have a few minutes left. So I want to just catch your attention with this. How do I apply the faith of Abraham if he's the father of faith, the father of us all? How do I apply that? How do I be a person that chooses every day and daily? I want to choose what's right. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be angry at people. I mean, lots of us do that. I don't want to be frightened of judgment as a believer, because some believers are still doing that. I don't want to be drawn after my own pleasures. I don't want to have this reaction to religion. I don't want to be there. I want to be somebody that applies the faith of Abraham. I want to follow in my father's footsteps. I want to gain heaven and shun hell. I want to gain it by taking hold of the gift that God gives me and running out. And it comes down to a couple of questions. Number one, who am I going to worship? Who am I going to worship? Number two, what voice am I going to listen to? Because there are many voices that speak to you and speak to me daily. Never stop. Chatter, 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 chatter. Never stops. Take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. In 2 Corinthians, the chatter doesn't stop. What steps will I take to prepare for that death? 1 Corinthians 15:32 says this. We're here. 15:32. It must be just after 31 if I can find it. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, no, that will not be the right one. Yeah, it is. Sorry. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought the wild beasts at Ephesus? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. What am I going to do to avoid that sort of mindset? Because there's so many voices that call and whisper. What's the point? Give up. God isn't. God hasn't. You didn't pray right. You're useless. I mean, there's millions of things that just crack off on the inside of us. So what am I going to do? Who will I listen to? Who will you listen to? And whom am I going to place my faith when I think about Abraham and how he focused and channeled his faith? See, I really believe in one way or another, God has reached out to every human being across our planet. I really believe it. I can't think that God doesn't. I think God whispers in the darkest places, no matter where it is in the world, about choosing him. And that's why no matter where you go, people worship something, because God's put in them eternity. God does that. That's what Ecclesiastes says. And whom will I put my faith? Deep down, everybody, I can't change this. Everybody believes there's a creator, there's a God. And they make a decision he doesn't exist. Everyone on this planet, they make a decision. Or someone tells them and they decide to believe it. But they know there's someone that's holy, and there's a sense that he wants them to come to him. And that arms you if you're sharing and you're caring to want to win somebody. You know what they're thinking. But at this point, the battle begins. And the battle begins in the mind as the voices operate with accusations, false teachings, temptations, and doubts. Because there's a spiritual magnetism, there's a gravitational force, as it were, that pulls you and I to consistently resist being awakened to more and more of who he is and the beauty of his son. There's something that says, I want to pull you away. I want to cause you to think differently so you don't see it. But he is there. Book of Acts 17, verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. You guys really search for God and worship. For as I passed along and observed the object of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world, this is the creator, and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. God gives everything to every person on this planet. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek after God. God said, I put this in your heart, unbeliever, that you would seek me, that you would find me. No matter where they are, God says, I made every human being on the planet to seek after me, to pursue. They made choices. And perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Powerful when you think of who God is and how he set this whole thing out. Abraham was called, what did it say? What do we read? He didn't even know the name of the person that called him. He didn't know who he was. He just was called. The one who said, leave your family, he didn't say, hey, by the way, my name is Billy, follow me. He didn't know his name. He's just spoken to you in his heart, and he responds. He wandered and was guided until he found a new land. But he had to make a choice when God said, leave, come, follow, seek. He had to make a choice. The other thing, he didn't have any natural reason to follow God. There was nothing. He just said, look, here's a promise. Look, I'm going to do this for you. He didn't know if God, in real terms, could actually give him or fulfill the promise to Sarah because he was old. But he went, I'm going to choose to believe this. This is where I'm going to place my hope. It made no sense when God asked him to offer up Isaac when his son came. Like, that wouldn't have made any sense if you understand the story. I mean, this was meant to be his first. This was this promised child. That doesn't make any sense. But he said, I'm going to believe the same God. He chose to believe. In Hebrews 11, go back to Hebrews 11 where we started in verse 17 and 19. Ready here it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did not receive him back. He had no reason to say, God said it's going to be all right. There's nothing that made him think, but he made a choice. I'm going to believe him. He'll raise my son back to life. He can do this. Abraham was full of decisions. The one that said, I'm waiting in heaven, I'm waiting on that promise. And all this has been recorded. All these things have been recorded. And all his decisions to believe in God were tested. Not only were they tested, you and I know today that everything that Abraham was promised was fulfilled. God fulfilled every promise to him. And we've got an advantage of looking back and saying, God done it. Just like he said he would do, he done it. Just when it looked like it wouldn't happen, he still pulled it off. God literally filled every one. And just as we close tonight and just finish off, I wonder what it is that you need to make a choice about tonight in your life. What do you need to choose to believe about God that you've been playing with, or you think maybe God's give up on you, or maybe you thought, Lord, I need to change and it never happened, and God says, I just want you to keep believing me. Maybe it's a person you believe for, maybe it's, I just wonder what it is you need to say, God, I need to change a decision from not believing to I'm believing today. Maybe you're the person that feels you can never overcome, and God says, I made you an overcomer. But there's a choice to believe. What step will you take? Will it start with a confession? Will it start with a prayer? But will you make a decision? I'm going to believe. I'm going to choose to believe. I'm going to believe there's change that can come to me and around me because he is who he said he is. And he's bringing all his promises in the Bible to happen, to manifest and appear. So let's stand to your feet. Worship team, come on up.